Okay, you're good to go.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the first meeting of the Budget Education and City Services Committee for CB5 for 2023. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Renee Kinsella. I'm the chair of the Budget Education and City Services Committee of CB5, BEX for short. Julie Chu is the co-chair of this committee. We have 4 items on the agenda this evening, no action items. Our first item tonight is Councilmember Powers on his legislative priorities for 2023. Thank you, Councilmember, for being here. We're then going to hear from the Department of City Planning, DCP, who's going to give us a presentation and review of the annual Community District Needs Statement and budget process. Then we have IBO, the Independent Budget Office, who's going to give us a review of their New York City fiscal outlook for 2023. And then finally, the New York City Civil Liberties Union is going to give us their presentation on the NYPD's Strategic Response Group. And then we're going to end with new business. So just a brief overview of how the committee works. Each presenter will have the opportunity to present to the committee. And after their presentation is concluded, the committee will have the opportunity to ask questions of the presenter. And when all of the committee's questions have been answered, members of the public will then have the opportunity to also ask questions of the presenter. And once all of the questions have been addressed, the committee goes into business session. And that's when only members of the BEX committee discuss the issue amongst themselves and determine what action to take. BEX is a little bit different than some of the other committees in that we don't have applications. So our determinations are not as straightforward. We can decide to draft a resolution to support an issue, decide to seek further information, or use the presentation just to inform collective knowledge going forward so that we can take action at a later date. When the committee does have an action before it, the issue is voted upon by all present members of the BEX committee. If the resolution passes, it's presented then to our full board for a vote, and that vote then is the final position of our board. Our next full board is not until January 12th, so anything we do tonight won't be heard in action by the CB5 committee until that time. Again, not relevant this evening as we don't have an action item, but we do have a lot on the agenda, so we'll get right to it. Councilmember Powers, thank you very much for being with us this evening. We really appreciate it. Happy New Year. Grateful for you being here. Tell us about your legislative priorities for 2023.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for having me, and right back to business we are. So thank you guys as always, and thanks always for your service to the committee board. We are going to have a very busy year in the council. We have, as many folks know, we had brought in a whole new council for the most part last year, 30-something plus new members, and rolling into now what I think is going to be a busy legislative year for us with everybody sort of settled in now. I have a number of bills I'll talk about. I'll try to keep it kind of quick. That some have had hearings already, some have hearings coming up, and some are on their way. So a couple bills. One is I think a little bit was going to talk about today was one of the bills that we have introduced, which I know a lot of folks know, I've heard about, is our Fair Chance Housing Act, which is about housing discrimination. It's something I care very, very deeply about. It is about offering people second chances. And we had a hearing on this bill a few months ago, and are still working on it in the post-hearing phase. But the whole goal here is to make sure it gets easier for people who've had a criminal justice passed or conviction to be able to access housing, which is a major factor and problem when it comes to restabilizing their lives. So we have, we're working on that and had a hearing on that bill so far, and happy to answer any questions. I was on Brian Lehrer actually this morning talking about it a bit. So happy to talk about that. A bill we just had a hearing on a few weeks ago is a bill to convert the city fleet to electric vehicles. We had a hearing at the Environmental Protection Committee hearing last month, and it would, on my bill, it requires city to only purchase zero emission vehicles starting in 2025, and then over the next 10-year period, transition the entire fleet. So as they retire vehicles, to bring on new vehicles that are zero emissions. This is obviously meant to reduce emissions here in the city, improve air quality. It will reduce our spending in the long term, and it will obviously set a very strong precedent for cities about what the expectations are. We are seeing that some of our fleet is already moving over, but we're not doing it, I think, at the speed that we should be doing it. So we're trying to push forward on this and also reflect some of the realities of how long it might take to convert the entire fleet. So that one got a hearing. We have lots of sponsors on that. I think almost a super majority of the council on it. and are looking to get that bill passed. We also, one that you guys might care about if you're, victims of this, but we have a whole package we introduced in October. We called Stop Spreading the Noise, which is a comprehensive package of 6 bills about excessive noise in the boroughs. It is one of those frequent complaints you get if you are representing Manhattan is helicopter noise, vehicle noise, noisy neighbors, construction, you name it. So I have not really seen too many bills aimed at actually taking. I think we've resigned ourselves to just dealing with those issues. But we have a bill that's around transforming our helicopter fleet to quieter and newer helicopters that are coming on that will definitely address noise. We have a bill about noise cameras that are coming online now with the DEP, and we're going to try to get some for District 4 that actually will measure and register vehicles that are too noisy because they've been altered or amended in some way. We have a bills around, and some of the bills I really like are actually about enforcement of noise. We get calls all the time from people. They call and they say, well, I called 311. I don't even know what happened to my complaint. And the truth is we don't know sometimes either where these end up. So reforming 311, reforming the reporting process, reforming the enforcement process, giving people access to the reports, giving people more transparency about what happened when they made a call. All those things we think will help with making sure that people actually get a better understanding of how the enforcement's happening. And often we see things closed minutes after the report was made, which seems like a real problem. So we are actually going to make sure that we can then keep an eye on it and see exactly which agency is doing enforcement and then ask for a follow-up on that. So all of those are meant to tackle actually issues that come through my office all the time. I represent the 34th Street Heliport. My district, as you guys know, has a lot of construction. We have noisy vehicles, and we have constant complaints about noise. I have the Midtown Tunnel and other places. So we really try to give people some more quality sleep and quality of life in their lives. And then a few more bills. We have a package of bills we did to protect freelancers, which is to make sure that our folks who are freelancers here in the city get better protections, which we've worked on in the past, but we want to kind of keep moving that ball forward. And then the last one is the one that's going to have a hearing, I believe, in February, which is called the Sweet Truth Act. And this is one builds on other measures to do this in the past, but it requires chain restaurants to start including warning icons on menu items that contain more than the recommended daily amount of added sugars. So if that one item has more than the recommended daily amount of added sugar, there'll be a warning sign. And that is to give New Yorkers a better opportunity to understand what's in their food, what they're eating, what choices they're making. And while it's not a mandate that they can't purchase it or something, it will at least give them some certainty about and some nutritional information before they go and consume that. And I think what we found is a lot of common items that you might get, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, as some perpetrators of this, but a lot of different fast food restaurants have very, very sugary items that we are consuming every day, and they are way above what's recommended, and we don't even know it. So what we're trying to do is make sure that people, and even people drinking iced tea at a fast food restaurant, I think we think it's healthy, it's iced tea, but it's packed with sugar. So giving people a better understanding of what they're eating is a big part of, we think, keeping people healthy. And then finally, we're looking at a lot of different other quality of life items. We're looking at construction and scaffolding. We're looking at things that come through our office every day and ways to better legislate it. So if you have ideas, development, we deal with a lot in CB5 in my district, ways to make sure that we are tackling issues that rise with that, thinking about housing and how important it is that we are both protecting tenants and building more housing here in the city. We're always looking and looking at more ideas to do that. So always also welcome any people who want to give us a good idea that might turn into a bill or a law one day. We have a couple other bills we're doing about whistleblower protections and other things, but I won't bore you with all the details, and just happy to take questions about anything we're working on.
Thank you so much. Questions from the committee? Any questions from the committee? Chuck.
I'll jump in. Hi, council members.
Hey there.
you happy new year.
You too.
Appreciate the legislative update. I think one of the things that the committee has struggled with in looking at these various enforcement issues is what can we do on the budget side to make sure that the city has the resources necessary and allocates them to actually put some emphasis behind these bills.
Yeah, that's a great question because we pass the bills and sometimes we don't know what happens to them. In some cases, the reason why on like the noise issues, for instance, I'm putting some effort into giving us more information. So if you file a report, you can get access to that report. You can see what the result of it was, who enforced it. I can look at that. You can look at that. We can figure that out. Is to then better identify where the gaps are. And also, know that 311 isn't just a pretend phone number, that there's actually something that's happening when you call it and there's follow-up. But no doubt there's a lot of agencies here that are starving for resources. And particularly right now, we're seeing a lot of agencies that are missing staff, wide vacancies, unfilled roles. And then secondary, we have a budget coming up that's not going to be as friendly as the other ones when it comes to needing to cut. I think for what you guys can focus on for sure is identifying areas where, starting soon, the mayor is going to introduce this budget process wise, is going to introduce a preliminary budget for the year, like in the next couple of weeks. And then we're going to do a budget response from the city council that says, well, here's what you're missing and here's what we prioritize. And we're going to head into but before that, we're going to head into our preliminary hearings on the budget. Anybody's welcome to join those, watch those, participate, just observe. And that will give you some flavor in some of these agencies about exactly what they need and what they're missing. But for us, we know, when we talk about noise, DEP inspectors, there's not enough for them. One agency that desperately needs resources, the HPD, the ability to close out on these housing deals that we passed a rezoning, we put a deal in place, 50% affordable housing, whatever it is. The ability to actually close the deal and implement it is really restrained by the lack of people at that agency to be able to do that work. And it's such important work. It's about affordable housing and just housing here, period. So mostly about affordable housing. So those agencies need it. If we ever can be a resource to getting guys documents or getting a better understanding of what agencies are filled or need filling, it's part of our budget documents. We can help you find those answers or work with finance about to do it. But I would tell you a lot of agencies need resources right now. And it's actually going to be less about who needs and where to prioritize. So what is helpful as we start the budget process this year is to give some sense of what priorities are for folks who live in this area. What agencies do need those resources more than others, and because we have a library system that's facing deep cuts, education, we have just coming from everywhere. And so schools, of course, they're one of our biggest budgets are always, they're always in the dialogue about how much to fund them. So it is helpful to hear people's priorities about where they think the city should be headed.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Joseph.
Thanks, Renee. Thanks, council member.
Sure.
So I'm really interested in the package of noise bills you mentioned, especially the noise camera concept. I guess my question is, do you foresee, or are you already experiencing any significant opposition to especially that component of it that kind of takes enforcement out of, any person's hands or agency's hands and seeks to automate it?
No, I think the opposition will come if we get move on the bill, which will be from folks who are normally automatically opposed to all the cameras, because we have a contingent mostly in these more out of boroughs, more car reliant communities that think this is all, too much. I don't believe that most of the folks that we're talking about here will be impacted by this, but there will be opposition probably from that crew who feels like they're over ticketed and punished for driving and whatever you want to say. I will say this, I think there's a lot of appreciation, support for it, like the DEP. So let me tell you where it's at right now. The DEP has a pilot program, I believe, of 6 cameras that they have put out into different parts of the city to test and see how they would work. It's based on stuff happening in other cities. I think Paris right now has a functional program that's being used. And so we're looking at it. So far, it feels like there's a couple obstacles. One is, I like when there is a noisy situation, and if it's in like on the LI, like they had one camera near the LIE, identifying which vehicle is the exact causer of that noise when there's 5 going by, that's one issue. The other issue is that a lot of the vehicles that are the worst offenders, a quarter of them, I'd say, or maybe a little more than that, don't have license plates, have obstructed license plates. You can't actually hone in on seeing who they are to write them a penalty. That's where the problem lies, it seems like right now. They have started to relocate some of them away from really, really like LIE type of situations to streets where you could better identify to see how they work. And I think they're working more successfully there, but you still run into this issue of identification. I believe they are rolling more cameras out soon. I've actually requested one. I think we're getting one in my district. I think Councilmember Botcher has requested one. I think he's getting one in his district. I think mine's gonna be maybe near the Midtown Tunnel because it's pretty noisy. But they're gonna roll more out. I think they're gonna keep rolling that and keep measuring as they do it. I think Paris has seen a successful endeavor here. I do think we're gonna run into some issues. I think something is better than nothing, even if we have to start figuring out how to address the folks who are obscuring and not having a license plate and things like that. But I think it's a good effort, and I think we're on a path somewhere, and my bill would make it a permanent program, and we, likely dictate how many cameras there can be and where they, how to do it. But I think we're still working with the DEP to figure out how their program's working so we can best tailor ours to what works and what doesn't work.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Questions from the committee? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Seeing none, may I just turn to I have people in the audience. I have 2 questions.
Oh yeah, of course.
From
Sorry.
the public. I have Guido. I'm going to not say the name correctly, I don't think. Please excuse me. Pompigil, I believe. Guido Pompigil. Am I saying that correctly?
The J is pronounced like an I, so it's Pompili.
Okay.
Straightforward. Yeah, I'd like to understand more what is being proposed in terms of removing the criminal record as a check when evaluating a tenant. I would like to have more details if this is for violent crime, is for crime that has happened like 10 years ago, or maybe just 5 years ago, or is any crime. And also, if the community thinks that it's important to give a second chance, I think should just be remove the record. Why limit to landlords trying to rent their apartment? Often these are small landlords, and they don't want to have in their apartment somebody that has had a past of criminal violence. And if that criminal violence has passed, like 15 years, is different that it was 5 years, or is different if it was 5 months. So I would like to know how articulated is the
So I think a couple of things. One is I think when you're talking about the look back periods of how long ago it was, I think that for most folks who are going to be let me say a couple of things. One is this is a bill that actually was introduced last term and was meant to take away the use of background checks, which is now sort of nationwide starting to happen. We saw Oakland just do this last week. New Jersey and Detroit moved into a different model. It's not a full removal, but it's some partial removal. We see Seattle, other cities starting to do these. There's a couple of reasons why. Number one is there are now, somebody even tweeted at me today, and a person, I was on Brian Lehrer today, and a person actually tweeted at me saying that they're filled with inaccuracies. And there's actually a good couple of reports that came out a month or 2 ago, right before a hearing, actually, that dictated a lot of the inaccuracies that reside within background reports. In fact, setting aside all the other issues, just background checks, period. And that even one person tweeted at me that she has never committed a crime, but because of her name, they mistook her for another person who got arrested for a gun possession charge, and she was unable to find an apartment and had to go and correct the issue. She was lucky enough to find that error. Most tenants don't get access to their background checks. You pay for it. And I don't know who's done this recently, but you pay for it. You get the landlord gets it, they evaluate it. You don't really normally have access to that. I've never had access to that. So if there's a mistaken identity, you're stuck. or until you have an opportunity to resolve it, or if the landlord raises it to you or something like that. So that feels like a fundamental issue is, are these right? Are they correct? And are we relying on them in an appropriate way? In other cities, the second part of the equation is a tougher conversation, which is we have folks, and we're not talking about, normally we're not talking about folks who, in some of the things you're talking about that offended 5 months ago, or talking about people that have re-entered and entered back here after, it could be any amount of time. And what I see often is this sort of vicious cycle where we are sending people basically to my district, which is fine. It's not fine, but it's okay to my district, and the 33 men shelter, and then sending them through the shelter system and really giving them no stable place to live. And for a lot of folks we have met 10 years, 12 years, 20 years, even 5 years later, they're unable to get an apartment, or they're getting routinely denied for apartment because of that past history. And they could be fully employed, have a family, all these other things. Now, I've been in a lot of conversations with folks about different ways to try to identify or screen or amend the bill to come up with different ways to look at how to address people that there might still be a concern about, and we're looking at that. But I think kind of foundational to this is that I think we've been running through the same cycle for a very long time, where people are living in our community. They're just forced to live in a shelter versus having access to housing. It doesn't mean they're not down the neighborhood, in our neighborhood, or not on the same block as us. It means that they don't have access to housing in a way that many of us others won't. And I understand that some people disagree with that because of the concerns, but I also think the flip side of it is on the public safety side is it's just very important, in my view, that people have an opportunity to stabilize their lives, and that creates to me a long-term safer city when we do that.
Yeah, I think it's important maybe to first give the tenants access to their criminal records when requested, so that they can confirm, does that mean it really happened? That should be easy to do and uncontested. I think there should be a look back period that should be substantial, cannot be 5 months. And I think maybe there could be a process through which the police can give some sort of like good standing. As you said, people that have now paid their duties and they're doing a regular life, they should have some sort of cleaning up process. I don't think it should be on the shoulder of the landlords. It should be something that the police does, or maybe the tribunal does. Either somebody is considered a member of society that has some issue or not. If it's not, should be removed for everything.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to leave that discretion up to other people to say exactly who, just to have a process to say who's a good citizen and who's not. And because we do have a system that, adjudicates those, does deal with that, and folks pay their sentence and return home. I think we are talking and looking at ways to protect and balance against some of the public safety concerns. And those are not complete conversations at this point. But I think everything you're saying, we've heard from folks, and we are trying to see how we can incorporate some things into the law here that we're doing. But I also have tried to, and I think you're doing that. I think steer people to understanding like the sort of larger goal here, alongside trying to balance against other concerns that might come up. And even with the question around how long ago the thing happened, we do have some folks who are ready to, on day one,
No, I understand. Whether there was maybe a pattern of going back and forth to jail.
Mr. Pompey, I'm just going to interrupt you there with your question. We have several people.
Okay, thank you. No problem. I find it disturbing, but okay.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to move to Rob Isaacs, a member of our committee, with his question. Thank you.
Yeah, hey, I just wanted to chime in on this. I think
You have a question,
some good discussion so far, and it's a complicated issue with a lot of really, really admirable goals. The issue that I am concerned about, that I'm hearing people this is, you know,
Rob, I'm afraid you're breaking up.
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit.
sorry, hold on. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
It auto connected me to some
Yeah.
Wi-Fi network. Sorry, guys.
All right.
I'm just concerned that like when it goes wrong, the remedies available to landlords are incredibly slow and painful, and the protections available to tenants are pretty robust. And so, you know, this landlord who's arguably doing nothing wrong, just trying to understand who they're renting their personal property to, but can end up in some really difficult positions, costing incredible amounts of money and a tremendous amount of stress and pain. And I could bore you with lots of stories I've seen in my career, but you know, is there anything, I would just ask that something be considered about, you know, how to deal with if you are going to ban the use of these reports and this information, that, you know, what happens when it goes wrong? And is there anything for a landlord to turn to when, you know, they might have been able to rely on this information to not get into the situation in the first place, and now they can't?
Yeah, look, I don't always think that necessarily. I think there's a lot of statistical evidence that points us to about the, you know, obviously it's still that level. Like it's in a lot of cases, it still allows you to use, you know, credit history and all other sort of normal information. So it's out, you know, the 40 times range and whatever. So I think from a payment standpoint, who's a good tenant in terms of being able to meet the obligations of being a good, you know, being a good renter, a good tenant. I think those protections are still there from do you evaluate and to know this person isn't financially stable to pay from that aspect of it. Look, I think that we, from the other standpoints of things, I mean, I think what we want to know is that person can pay the rent. They're going to pay the rent. They're going to pay you if you're, I don't know if you're a landlord or not, but you're going to pay you and meet their obligations under their lease and everything else. And they should be treated like a regular person who's able to do those things. And so we have, you know, we have put language in to deal with like liability concerns and things like that. I think you're talking about more, maybe the more of like the removal standpoint. We put like,
yeah, I'm referring more to like when there's a health and safety issue, the trouble that you can often have as a landlord just to get access to the apartment to correct it if somebody doesn't want you in there, and the months and months of housing court that's required to deal with that. So.
Yeah, I think the issue you're raising applies kind of more broadly than the group that we're talking about here, but I understand the concerns. I mean, look, we're talking to a lot of folks in the different worlds of small property owners and large property owners about this. And obviously that concern does come up. I'm not sure today what the immediate remedy is, but it's something we can talk to them about.
Okay. And then I think the second thing was on the flip side, you know, what I've seen is without enforcement, all this stuff becomes kind of window dressing anyway. So I know we've talked about that and funding already this evening, but I would just sort of add my voice to the choir that like, you can tell me not to use this, but if there's nobody really checking and nobody policing me, I think most landlords may use it anyway. And then have you really achieved anything? So I'm of two minds on this myself. So I understand.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But no, I appreciate you being thoughtful about it. You know, the agency that oversees discrimination from a housing standpoint, including source of income discrimination, has been an issue in the past, has been traditionally underfunded, and I've been fighting with others to get it more funding, to get more staffing. So that is an issue. I don't think it's not worth doing because, you know, it might be underfunded, but it's still important. You're totally right that it has some way to enforce the thing that you're doing, or else it falls on its face. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
I have Zul again, please excuse me, Zolkowitz, Mr. Zolkowitz.
Thank you, Renee. Zul is good, and you got it perfectly. Thank you. Council member, I recognize how focused you are on the nuts and bolts in your legislative priorities, and I really appreciate it. But you've mentioned a couple of times about our agencies lacking the resources they need to do the jobs that we want them to do. So I'm asking you to get behind your colleague, another of our council members in this board, Carlina Rivera, has introduced a resolution, Move the Money, which is asking for public hearings about moving the money from the federal military budget into municipal needs. And that would be of incredible value to us. I've been working in the last 4 months with Norman Siegel and Bob Hayes and others on a new homelessness project. And man, the resources are totally lacking. So if you could find about it, if you don't know, talk to Carlina, have your staff talk to hers. We'd really like people to get behind this, push this. We'd really love to have public hearings in New York City because it really is a national issue. In every major city, we need the funds. Thank you, Keith.
Got it. Thank you. I will take a look at it. I know I've seen it, but I haven't looked at it in detail. So I'll take a look at the resolution and take a look at signing on to it.
We know you got a full plate, so thanks.
That's all right. Appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, I have one last person, and please, it's questions for the council member. I'm sorry,
It's
council.
okay. Sorry.
Charles, if you have a question for the council member.
Yes. Hi, council member. Is there a way possibly of adding into your scaffolding bill some way of transmitting the information about where scaffolding is located for people with disabilities who are blind or in wheelchairs, so they know, which sidewalks might be closed or where they might have to walk into the street or into the building, because each scaffolding has a different configuration. Also, I'm wondering if there's a way that if there's no work being done, if there's a way that these construction workers should be able to bring down the scaffolding to bring access to the sidewalk, because there's no point just having it hanging around there for months and months. And I'm also wondering if there's a way to mandate some sort of color scheme to help people who are low vision to be able to see the bars of the scaffolding, because usually the scaffolding is very dull, it's very dimly lit. And I'm just wondering if there's a way of maybe mandating some sort of hazard tape or some sort of fluorescent taping on the individual bars to bring some sort of warning that, hey, there's bars in the way. There's been times when I've trying to get into my taxi and I've walked into like a scaffolding bar because I can't make it out. So I'm just wondering if more could be done. And I'm just one other quick question is, I wonder if you could please bring to the attention to the council that unfortunately the website for meetings and is not very accessible. In fact, sometimes I get alerts about meetings when they've already had the public hearing comment already finished. So I know we're short for time. So if there's a way I could speak with you offline, maybe you can send your information to the board and they can pass it on to me. It'd be great to talk more about.
Yeah, so I have a staff of Franklin in my office who I think is on here. He covers CB5 and you can reach out to the office and get our information, and Franklin or I can talk to you about those. But I understand all of them. On the scaffolding, I think there's definitely some ways to improve accessibility. We have some bills that maybe look at design and things like that. So we'll take in your feedback. And also, of course, I do recognize the importance of none, and I'm glad you raised it, for understanding where they are so people can get around the streets easier. So things we will incorporate, but you can email my office. It's on my website and the city council website, or you can go to the board and they'll give you our office information.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that has ended our questions. Just checking with the committee. Any more questions? We put you on the hot seat, Councilmember Powers. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me.
No more questions. Thank you very, very much. I
Thanks, guys.
appreciate it. And thank you.
See you later. Bye. Thanks.
Bye. Next up, we have a presentation that is super important to the committee, both a refresher for people who've been here for a while, as well as everybody who's just joined the committee. We have the DCP, we have Nicholas, John O'Neill Clark, Stephen Johnson, and Stephen Everett. They're going to speak to us about the budget process and the budget cycle. Very, very important. So I'm going to give it right over to you and Nicholas, and you can, I think you can control. Do you have the controls? I know that you have a presentation. I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you. And while Nick is setting up, Nick's going to share his presentation.
Okay.
I will just start with a brief intro. So let me start with a thank you for hosting us this evening. My name is Stephen Everett. I'm the Assistant Director of Planning Support at the Department of City Planning. So we've come this evening at the request of the board to introduce the CD needs process, which of course, as you said, is an annual cycle in which all 59 community boards submit their statement of neighborhood needs and their respective budget requests so that city agencies can review and inform their planning and budgeting process in the upcoming fiscal year. So we're hopeful that this will be of service to those who already know how the process works, and also to new members of the board and the public. And we appreciate that this mandate comes on top of other commitments of the board, and of course, right after a summer break is the time frame for the collection of input and the distribution into our process before the October 31st deadline. So we want to thank you for taking this process seriously every year and elevating your voices into the budgeting process. And so, as you noted, we'll provide a very brief presentation and then open it up for questions. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to introduce Nick Stampar, an analyst on the planning support team, and turn it over to him for screen sharing and this next portion.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, I just in time got the screen sharing figured out. Can everybody see that? Is that working all right?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, so we're just going to go over a general overview of the CD needs process in general, the annual calendar of sort of milestones, both for the city process as it relates to CD needs in general, but also for what the board is responsible for at different parts of that calendar, as well as the components of the submission that the board submits every year, their official district statement of needs, and some tips and tricks for submitting those and continuing to bolster those year after year with more robust submissions. So just to start, the statement of community district needs and community board budget requests are sort of this joint product that the every community district in the city, all 59, submit every year. And it's these two pieces together that form the full district statement of needs. The narrative sections, this community district statement of needs, are what describe in greater detail the issues related to the district, what priorities the community board has as it relates to those issues, key stakeholders that you might work with already on various projects that exist in the neighborhood. It's a great resource for really members of the public, members of the community board itself, members of our staff and other agency staff to get a window into what the community board is doing and thinking and views as the top issues as it relates to your district. The budget requests are sort of where the rubber hits the road on the topics discussed in the narrative sections. Those are the much more finely pointed requests from a variety of agencies. I think it's 28 in total that those requests go out to for specific needs that the district has that they would like to be considered in the upcoming fiscal year's budget. So sort of as a function of that, you're always submitting community board budget requests for a fiscal year further ahead in the future, so that, and we'll see in the calendar later, that it kind of rolls into when the preliminary budget comes out, those budget requests for that subsequent year are then considered for inclusion in agency budgets there. Those budget requests are either capital requests or expense requests, depending on the nature of the request. I've got here just sort of a quick poll from the submission from Community Board 5 this year was 39 capital requests and 25 expense requests, which is almost exactly on point for what OMB recommends in each of those categories. So that was great to see. And these are budget requests that are not only nitty gritty granular detail stuff that the community board comes up with, but it's also a reflection of input that the community board gathers throughout this calendar cycle from public input that can then be a form of public input being reflected directly into agency budgets. This is all completed on an annual cycle as part of a charter mandate. So there is sort of that weight behind it as well, sort of driving the process. And then we are here, which we'll discuss more later, as a resource to kind of help facilitate getting that charter mandate box checked. Here's the budget timeline, just as sort of a general overview for context. So right now we are in this January 2023 sort of transition period where the preliminary budget is sort of about to get worked on and published, and we just finished wrapping up our CD needs cycle with the October 31st deadline. Manhattan 5 did submit on time. That was great, incredibly helpful for us managing all of those submissions to have that in on time. So huge thanks to everybody that worked on that submission. And so this whole process happens every year, where the board works on its narrative and works on its priorities for its budget requests, submits those to us. We, in conjunction with the Office of Management and Budget, get those distributed to all of the relevant agencies, who then issue responses, reflect on those, and attempt to the best of their ability, work those into the budget for that next fiscal year. And then we do it all over again. Here is sort of a more, and I won't go into this in great detail. I can always send this presentation over for greater distribution later if we have any questions, or people just want to dig through it. This is sort of some of the more granular milestones that happen throughout the year. A big reference point is that this year, we're going to start our outreach to community boards to sort of help facilitate the beginning of the process earlier. So we're going to look to begin at least our preliminary outreach for supporting community boards in their submissions in May, as opposed to later on, usually during or after the summer break that we know a lot of boards struggle with, right in the middle of that window. So that's a good thing to look out for, is that, before the summer break, you'll hear from us about thinking about that community district statement needs a little earlier this year. So keep an eye out for that. And then, of course, the big highlight is that the submissions are due every year on Halloween. So that's a good date to have stuck in the front of your mind for when that date nears. It's especially good when planning ahead for it. We know that it gets a very cramped time of year. You come back from the summer break, and then you've got this deadline. You've got to have these meetings and do all this public input and get your statement of needs prepared and submitted all in that time. So it's good to keep that front of mind earlier in the year, so that it's not quite as much of a rush after that summer break concludes. Submission components. There are three major components here that we're going to break down real quick. The top three pressing issues is the number one component. That's the broadest bird's eye view of what are the top three issues that this community board considers to be the most pressing, and then each of those have a narrative associated with it. This is one of the categories, and most of the narrative categories fall into this umbrella. That Manhattan 5's submission this year was incredibly robust. Got a lot of great narrative content from the board. So excellent work there. This is a great tool for folks that are wanting to learn more about the community board and know really top of the line what are the issues the community board is really concerned about. This is sort of where they go for that. It's also really easy for when we are transmitting our analysis of all of the submissions after all 59 boards submit to the agencies. These are one of the analytics that really stand out. Top three issues. This is just an example from a Brooklyn community board in 2020 that we pulled. Here they've selected their top three issues are economic development and recovery, land use trends, and schools. And then they provide this explanation related to the economic development and recovery issue, explaining how exactly in what specific terms that issue is relevant to the district itself. So it allows, not only can we look at what the top three issues are and get a brief glimpse into what the board considers its top priorities, but then also there's the narrative section for a little bit deeper of a dive. And specificity is always key. That's something that we'll sort of hammer home in a lot of these tips, is that being able to tie your priorities to your budget requests and provide the greatest level of specificity in both narrative and budget request elements is a way to help improve the potential success rate, positive responses from agencies, things of that nature. The next section is the most important issue by policy area. So in addition to a top three pressing issues district-wide, all of the other district needs are split up into 7 policy areas, which is also sort of a convenient way for us to categorize what agencies are getting what responses is by policy area. And so this will give you an additionally granular level of detail on, in each policy area, what is the most important issue the district is facing. That way you're able to get more specific about, maybe one of your top 3 pressing issues wasn't transportation, but you had 4, you would have picked it as the 4th one. And so now here's your opportunity to talk about what's important to the district as it relates to transportation or, parks or whatever it might be. Here, just for reference, are our 7 policy areas with the breakdown of how each of those agencies are grouped in there. And so then even below that, in terms of greater specificity, you've got additional needs categories for each of these policy areas, which is how the community board budget requests are classified and then distributed to those agencies. And then we follow up with these agencies after the whole cycle has been completed to then report out to them on our view of things and analyzing what we saw as major patterns from across the city, across the 5 boroughs, to try to help shape and improve on the process for the following fiscal year. And then the third portion, which is usually the one that gets the most attention, is the budget request, because that's where we get really specific on actual asks that the community board is making of these agencies to include in their budgets. And these are listed in prioritized order. Both capital requests and expense requests get their own priority listing. So there's also sort of a logic behind listing certain things in higher or lower priorities than the year prior, keeping that content refreshed and updated, both as a form of advocating for those needs. Maybe you felt that there was a need in a budget request a year prior that wasn't addressed to the level that you were hoping, and so that gets bumped up to a higher priority in the next year to drive that home. These sorts of attention to detail are things that can really help the budget request section be more robust. Here's an example of a really good budget request from Bronx 7, where they were very specific about, this is a request for parks. They're reconstructing or upgrading a park or amenity. They specify what park it is, and then they also are very clear about what elements in the park need repair. And so they sort of hit all the notes here in terms of giving very clear instructions on the request. Parks knows exactly what's being asked of them and what they can do with this and whether it's feasible in the budget. And so it's much easier to get a clear response from the agency when all of those things are clearly delineated. The only caveat is that they have listed no supporters here, and sometimes that's the way it is, but with parks especially, maybe there's a Friends of Riverside Park or some other community agency that they could have incorporated. And we do highly recommend that if there are any other groups that the community board is affiliated with or working with on certain issues, listing those supporters is another way to bolster those budget requests. Here's an example of a budget request that this board submitted this year, sort of as a contrast example. So this was as a request to renovate accessibility in schools across the district. This is an example of, and we see this with a lot of boards, an excellent, obviously well-defined policy goal with accessibility in schools that does deserve that funding and attention. But then this was actually submitted last year and this year, the agency response from last year indicated that the request included more than one proposal. And so that they were only able to fund certain parts of it, and that it could have been strengthened had they been broken into multiple proposals. So it does become, it's a bit of a iterative task in creating these budget requests, but everything else about this, it's a very thorough budget request. But as you continue to break it down into more specific levels of detail, you're able to specify locations for each individual budget request, and each of those budget requests, by being specific and pointed in their own right, then have higher likelihoods of being able to get clearer responses from agencies. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that this as a form of communication between community boards and agencies, that this is working well for both parties. And so that's one of the top priorities. Some tips to wrap up before we move on to a quick resources available section. Number one is always start as soon as possible. We recommend starting to sketch out your submissions outside of the web form. The web form gets posted going into sort of late spring, early summer every year. And so before that's available, it's always good we've seen boards be really successful with doing their narrative sections in like a Word document that they can then copy and paste when the form does become available, or sketch out the budget requests in an Excel document so that it's easier to just kind of slide them over. When you end up in the web form forever and then you're trying to do it all at once, that can be a little confusing. So starting ahead of time and sketching out your submissions outside the web form can be really helpful. Narrative should be clear, ready to publish, and incorporate current data. We'll talk more about where you can get some of the most current data in this next section. Refreshing content, like I mentioned, is a must. You can always go review your previous year's reports, see where there might be opportunities to update some figures mentioned in a narrative section, or update with more specificity on a budget request that you want to include again, things of that nature, or even just reprioritizing the budget request is a really good way to re-emphasize or additionally underline certain requests. And then reference content across elements so that the reports are cohesive. If the narrative is very clearly reflected in the budget request and vice versa, if it's easy to connect those dots, that tells a clearer story to the agencies who are reviewing it. And again, makes it more likely that we'll get a clear response from the agency on whether they're able to fund it, or if not, what more could be done to get it funded. So then next, I'll just hand it back to Stephen for this quick reference on support for the community board and what resources are available before we make it to questions. So Stephen, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. So we'll highlight here several DCP resources that you may use and you may be familiar with already to help inform your CD needs submission, or throughout the year if you have questions about your community profile information. So the Community District Profiles is a web page that shows community statistics, land use maps, and other information about all community boards. It's also one place you can find your most recent CD needs reports. The Facilities Explorer is an interactive map of capital investment projects across the city. You can see the status of plans and projects for things like sewers, roads, parks, and schools improvements. Zola, of course, is our zoning and land use map. We can look at information about specific properties and what kind of development they are zoned for. And the Population Fact Finder is a great resource for all the latest information about the census findings. So you can select a neighborhood geography or an entire community district to look at, and it's up to date with 2020 census data findings. Next slide, Nick. We also have the options for collecting input. You can download on our website a paper survey where you can distribute at community boards. I heard you discussing, going back in person. Many community boards distribute these, for example, at an in-person meeting, collect feedback during the meeting, and then they have it by the end of the meeting. We also have an option where we can create for you an online survey, or you can do it yourself. And in fact, some boards prefer to do it themselves to have more control over that survey. But you can do it in an online form such as Google Forms or Microsoft Forms to collect that input. And this year we provided it for how many boards, Nick? How many boards did we provide this survey?
I think 2 with the full analysis on the back end.
Okay, so it's one tool that we're trying to roll out and make ourselves more available for your use. And next slide, Nick. And some of you may be already aware and attending or have attended a borough budget consultation, which are hosted by the Office of Management and Budget. At these online sessions, board members will hear from specific agencies about the agency priorities, goals, and budget constraints for the upcoming year. And this information should help you align your budget requests with things each agency is able to provide. So this is the schedule for this past year. It is not the schedule for this coming fall, but we can provide that schedule as well as OMB's. OMB should reach out to you as well in the summer to provide this schedule. But again, it's there for resource for you. And last slide, here's our email address. This will if you email this, it will go to everybody on the planning support and CD needs team. Right now, it is just me and Nick. But this year we are anticipated growing once again, and this is by far the easiest way to reach us. So that's cdneeds_dl@planning.nyc.gov. So let us know if you have questions about the CD needs process, your own submissions, or the resources we've discussed above. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so excited about that survey. We did it ourselves. I didn't know you guys did it. So That's exciting to know.
We can discuss the pros and cons. You will have more control over it if you have that capability. But for those boards who don't have that capability or really just are understaffed or without that capacity, we can provide it.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Zona.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I was wondering if you had any advice about budget requests where like more than one agency may be involved, but it's not super obvious like which agency it should go to. Like as an example, like a lot of folks are saying there's a lot of sidewalk sheds, but they don't know if it's like DOT or sanitation who really is managing that process. How would you recommend going about budget requests for those types of issues?
Yeah, so in an example like that, we can discuss ahead of the submission of the form. In this particular example, I would direct that to DOT, but it's also on the responsibility of planning support and OMB to direct the budget request to the proper agency so that you don't get a response from agency 1 that just says, this isn't us, you should have contacted agency 2. But during the preparation of your budget requests and CD need statements, if you have questions like this, send them our way and we'll make sure that you have the right agency.
Super helpful, thanks.
Of course.
Other questions? I have a question. How do we sometimes find out if we see a recurring problem that we've had on our budget request list? We're not quite sure. We think it may have been funded, may not have been funded, but we know that the problem is still existing. How do we determine, it has been funded, it definitively has been funded. The work may have not been done, but where do we find that? Because we sometimes go back and forth, like, yes, it has been funded, not done yet, but how can we, or should we err on the side of, let's just put it in again?
Yeah, the latter tactic is the one that most community boards employ. It is the one to provide the greatest assurance that it doesn't fall off the radar, but it may not be the most helpful tactic to make sure that the implementation actually happens. By far, the easiest thing to do would be to contact the rep, your liaison at that agency. If you have specific examples that you need our help to, contact the agency, we can do that. And so, for example, some agencies will often give a response such as, we need more information about this request. We can't fund it as you've written it, but this requires a discussion. And then it's always on the board's responsibility to contact the agency. Some boards, again, have that capacity. We know that some boards really never contact the agency, and then it becomes this cycle of requesting the same thing and getting the same answer. This may be a similar situation that is most easily solved just by contacting. And this is actually the piece that Nick and I would like to grow more this year, to make sure that where an agency has suggested that a board follow up with them to discuss a specific issue, that discussion happens before the next submission, because it's not helpful for the board or the agency to see the same request be submitted and responded to in the same format without this next piece. So again, if you have an example, we're happy to take it back.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions from the committee? Anything? I doubt that panelists have any, how do we get the budget consultations to be more useful, more timely responses by agencies? Many of the questions are sent ahead of time, but the responses don't really come before the meeting. Can you be more helpful with that, maybe?
That one I cannot promise. The borough budget consultation process is one that OMB manages, but the complaint you just raised is one that we are aware of, and we'll discuss again with OMB this year. It's a fact that DCP is not involved whatsoever in that consultation process, in the scheduling of it, in the submission of questions, nor in the responses that agencies provide. But we'll bring it up and see what we can do.
Thank you. Thanks, Marissa. Any other questions? I'm going to throw it out to members of the public. I doubt this is more a board issue, so I doubt that there's going to be anything there. I don't see any hands. I'm going to thank you so much for being here. We're going to be in touch. We're going to look at our submissions, see if we have anything that we can circle back. I'm very mindful and very grateful that you came tonight, but also very grateful on making sure that we actually do reach out and do have those conversations with the agency. So thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much, Nick. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having
thank you so
us.
much. Yeah,
Thank you. And if we could get a copy of the presentation, that would be fantastic. I'll send it out.
sure.
to you.
Yeah, I'll send the deck over to you after we're off.
You certainly can. And now that we've made this connection, we'd love to work with you on a bespoke strategy with you in this upcoming cycle. All of the needs of every board are unique, so we'd love to find out what yours are and help serve you better.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Okay, we're taking you up on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Okay. And this sort of follows hand in hand. Logan, the Independent Budget Office, you sort of it goes right hand in hand. You're up to sort of give us your predictions, and I will turn it over to you. This is also important and goes, it sort of helps us as we make our requests.
Absolutely. More than happy to be here tonight. My name is Logan Clark. I am the Assistant Director of Budget Review at the Independent Budget Office. I'm joined tonight by Michael Jacobs, our Assistant Director of Economics. And let me go ahead and share my screen real quickly. And
I'm sorry, Michael. I saw you down there and I didn't introduce you. How are you? Thank you.
All right, and then let me go ahead and start our slideshow. Great. So yeah, today we're just here and we are going to be discussing our December 2022 fiscal outlook, which is both our forecast of the city's economy, as well as a response to the mayor's November plan. And so just before we get into that, just wanted to give everybody a quick update, or not really update, but just a reminder of who we are. We are the Independent Budget Office. We're a nonpartisan city agency, and our duty is to provide information and analysis on the New York City budget, its economy and policies to public and elected officials. We have a charter mandated dedicated budget line, so we cannot have our budget cut by a partisan mayor or anyone else. So our budget is pegged in the charter, which is great. We are charter mandated to produce 3 reports each fiscal year, and that's in response to the November plan, the preliminary budget, and the executive budget. And we don't do one for the adopted budget, or at least not mandated. I believe that at some point in time we've produced analysis about it, but it's for the other 3 financial plans of the year. And each of those mandated reports includes an independent economic and tax forecast, a reestimate of the city's budget, and our estimate of the gap in surplus. And that's sort of what we're here to discuss with you tonight, is our most recent mandated report. Additionally, we produce our own internal research questions on policy issues and other matters of fiscal import. And then we also take requests for research from community boards and other folks. So, and so our staff are really here for you. We deal with community requests all the time. Community boards reach out to us, advocacy groups reach out to us, elected officials reach out to us. So if you've got big questions, little questions, we're always here for you guys. And we also have several other things just on our website that has things like data dashboards, historic spending for the city budget, and also a set of budget options. So, you know, if we're looking at achieving savings within a particular budget cycle, that's a tool that agencies and elected officials can sort of look at as a potential option. So, but delving right into our December fiscal outlook, this came out just a couple of weeks ago, right before the Christmas break. And so this was in response to the mayor's November plan. And so first thing that we just sort of want to talk about is what's the bottom line coming out of our report. Right now, we're projecting a 2.2 current year surplus. So we're in fiscal year 2023, which will end in June. For those of you who are careful watchers of the budget, that should be no surprise. Our surplus is driven primarily by higher than administration forecasted revenues, and that's slightly offset by higher spending that we're also forecasting. For next year, we are anticipating a gap of about 2.4 billion. This is roughly in line with where we were last time or last year, like right around this sort of plan time. So it's not really an unmanageable gap. It's pretty well within sort of our usual out year one gap as we sort of enter prelim, the preliminary budget, that is. However, after the 2024, the next fiscal year, our gaps do grow substantially, increasing to 4.6 billion in 2026 eventually. And so there's a couple of pitfalls out there. Things are a little bit uncertain, as we've been sort of saying, there's no rosy optimism, but our forecast is a bit more optimistic than the Adams administration. So while the Adams administration might be saying, you know, we need to cut X, Y, and Z, I think we're probably more in a sort of wait and see approach at this point in time. And so with this, Michael's actually going to give us a update on the U.S. economic forecast and everything that IBO has been working on to create that forecast.
Okay, thank you, Logan. Well, the update will be on our both our U.S. economic forecast and a forecast for the New York City, and then I'll turn to our revenue forecast. And I put these charts in, not that I think anyone's going to absorb them right now, but they will be in the packet that you're eventually sent when we clean it up a little bit. But what's I think remarkable, or maybe unremarkable, next slide, Logan, is that the economic forecast of IBO and OMB, they don't really differ much. Neither of us are predicting a recession. We certainly are predicting much slower growth for the last quarter of this year and for the first two quarters this year, last quarter of 2022, and certainly for the first two quarters of this year, but not a recession. There's been a full recovery of the job losses in the nation due to the losses of jobs due to the pandemic. Strong consumer demand has been generating the post-COVID economic growth. The unemployment rate has been remarkably low. It's vacillated between 3.5% and 3.7% in the last several months. And those are all good things. What's not good, of course, is that inflation, which started to develop in 2021, has persisted. Initially, because of COVID and health restrictions, there was less demand for services by consumers and stronger demand for goods. And this is where supply problems of tangible goods due to disruption of global trade, really, you had a situation where strong demand was met by supply problems, and that generated inflation in many areas. The semiconductor shortages and shortages of building materials and energy prices that started to go up really quite strongly in 2021. It was exacerbated this year by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have all been fueling inflation. Next slide, please. And, inflation reached 9% in the middle of last year, highest level in 40 years. The Federal Reserve is pursuing a tighter monetary policy of raising interest rates to reduce economic growth and reduce inflationary pressures. They're target rate is 2%, and their goal is for a soft landing, which can be described as slowing economic growth without generating a recession. And this is not something, it's something we are predicting is most likely to happen, but there's certainly many risks involved with this. So this is our forecast, but it's by no means a very certain forecast. But along with our forecast, we are expecting much slower growth in the national level in 2023, and that's going to carry over to the local economy. There's some good signs that core inflation has been moderating. On the other hand, the labor market continues to be tight, and the concern is that we'll get a wage price cycle, a self-generating cycle where wage increases fuel consumer price increases, and the pattern continues. Next slide. And for the for the local economy, again, there's not a whole lot of difference between the IBO and OMB forecasts. I think the biggest difference comes in the expected slowdown of employment growth in 2023. Last year, employment growth was over 200,000. Our number, I think, is probably going to be a little higher than 250,000 jobs when we get the latest numbers for December, and that won't be for another few weeks. But we're predicting a market slowdown in income and job growth in 2023, and then a rebound to sort of more normal levels for an expansion. Not the super growth that we had seen for a while before COVID hit, but decent growth of 80,000 jobs a year. We also predicting a moderation of the inflation rate along with our soft landing scenarios. Next slide. And while we are predicting job growth, still the job loss in New York City due to the pandemic was worse than the job loss nationwide, and the recovery has been slower. We're still only at about 97% of regaining the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. I think our latest projection is that we will finally regain all the jobs back sometime in 2024. Next slide. And what's the employment has recovered, but it varies by sector. The sectors, and I don't know on your screen, my screen, the right side is cut off, but I guess I can switch this over here. We've seen strong growth in professional services, information, and healthcare. Those industries are at the top of the graph, and the light blue bar that is that extends to the right of the 0% line indicates that we've already surpassed in those industries, past the pre-pandemic employment levels. Of all these sectors, I'm actually a little concerned right now about information. While Twitter's problems have not really hit New York, we don't have a lot of exposure. There seem to be a lot of other problems going on in social media, and I think this is a cause for concern, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some weaker growth going on, weaker than we have predicted. This was about a prediction made over a month ago. The weak sectors you can imagine are retail and leisure and hospitality. These are sectors that lost a lot of jobs, and the combination of the fall off in tourism and the lack of lack of commuting into the city due to hybrid work schedules has been hurting retail and leisure and hospitality. I think one of the things that someone had written us, he said we were interested in the arts sector. That's not doing very well, according to last time I looked at the statistics, and I don't have a separate forecast for that. But the employment to date is still far short of what it was prior to the pandemic. Next slide. And, one of the interesting things is that personal income was actually quite strong during the pandemic, and that's because of the extended and enhanced unemployment benefits and other income support measures on the federal level. So, wage and salary income, which is by far the largest component of personal income, declined. But this was more than offset by an increase in transfer payments. Now, now that the transfer payments have pretty much the extra transfer payments due to COVID recovery policies, now that those have worn off or have faded, we see little personal income growth in 2022. Despite some personal income growth. And after 2022, we see growth ranging from 4.3 to 5.3%. And this sort of income growth is typical for New York City. A lot will depend on, not just job growth, but also growth in non-labor forms of income, particularly capital gains income, which is very large, accounts for a disproportionately large percent of income. Next slide, please. And, I just want to say about two industries I want to just talk about a little bit. I think we're trying to be cautious about the fate in predicting the future for the financial services firms. Financial firms have made a ton of profits in recent years, but basically that's because with low interest rates locked in for so long or persisting for so long, their cost of funds was very minimal, and that's what kept them afloat for many years. And last year interest rates were quite Wall Street profits of Wall Street firms were quite strong at 58 billion. That's second highest ever. And this year they've fallen to an estimated 24 billion. This is being played out in bonus compensation. We only have December information on personal income tax returns, but there's an indication that the estimated 20% decline in bonus payments is starting to happen. It's also the high interest rates have led to the end of the bull market, and that's going to affect capital gains. Real estate is also going to has been very affected by the inflation and the Fed's policies to fight that, as well as by hybrid work schedules. The pandemic has impacted the value of commercial real estate sales much more than residential sales. The recovery has been stronger for residential sales. There's, in the long run, this year we think there's going to be a 13% decline in commercial sales, and because of the shrinking demand for offices, not quite as they're not going to continue to decline, but they're not going they're going to be fewer and fewer of these large commercial sales, which really generate a lot of income tax money for the city. And I'll come back to that point. We're also expecting higher interest rates to weaken residential sales. Next slide. And this is something you'll see when you get the handout, but this is from our fiscal outlook report, our actual revenue forecast. If you go to the next slide, please, Logan. We are seeing a total of almost $2.4 billion extra revenue this fiscal year. A lot of it from the personal income tax revenue. And one thing I want to make clear is part of this is because OMB did not adjust their forecast from the adopted budget to November. They made very few changes. There's a lot of money that's come in the personal income tax collections that that they have not recognized. Similarly with corporation tax revenue. So we're seeing a lot of upside this year, in at least relative to OMB. Next slide. Next slide. However, the difference in our forecasts, the degree to which IBO is forecasting more revenues than OMB declines in 2024, and then it starts to increase again. And our higher forecasts are largely because of the property tax, also because of the corporate and personal income taxes, less so. However, our projected growth of income is not that great. I don't want people to think that, oh, we're so optimistic and unrealistic. This is not a particularly rosy revenue forecast. We've very little growth this year, 0.8% decline, a bit of a decline next year, and pretty modest rates of growth in the final 2 years of the financial plan. And I could say something about the different taxes. I'll just mention a few things. There's concern that with the personal income tax, there's a feeling that a lot of the wealthiest people in New York who earn a lot of money and contribute to a disproportionate amount of personal income tax revenue, that they're moving out. I don't think there's clear evidence about that yet. We've gotten data for 2020. Calendar year 2020, and there's been a certain amount of upper income, the decrease from 2019 to 2020 in the number of upper income filers is certainly there, but what's much bigger is a very large increase in the number of people reporting less than zero income due to business losses and, to a lesser extent, capital gains losses. So they may have seen several stories about how IBO has saying that the rich are moving out. No, that's not what we're saying. First of all, we wouldn't come to that unless there was more evidence. And without knowing who exactly is moving out and who's taking their place, and where these negative income people are coming from. Were they people that were previously making a lot of money through business? We don't know that yet. So we're looking forward to getting 2021 data for calendar year 2021 later this spring and summer to revisit that. And we're, of course, watching tourism and what it's doing to sales and hotel tax. It seems to be helping a lot. But again, if you compare our 2023 forecasts with what we're seeing in the years following, I'll just summarize it in general. the growth rates that we're seeing in 2023 are not rebounding to any great extent in 24 through 26. So, yeah, I say and I can provide details if people have questions about specific taxes, but I just want to stress that our forecast is not, it's not rosy, and it's not wishful thinking, and it's conservative in its own way. So there could be upside, but there's also a lot of risks with the national economy and the local economy, particularly with respect to the financial sector and what it contributes to tax revenue. And I think that's it. Later we'll have questions if people have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the differences that the fiscal outlook from IBO has from the administration's November plan on the spending side. And so the three sort of like main areas that we have that are causing that are contributing are part of the $2.2 billion surplus in fiscal year 23. We're really talking about the treatment of the fiscal risk posed by the arrival of asylum seekers to New York City. We're also forecasting higher costs incurred by uniformed agencies on OT, and so that's Department of Correction, the Police Department, Fire and Sanitation. But then we're also projecting lower fringe and debt service costs. And so all told, that nets out to about $228 million more in expenditures than the administration is projecting. But if you remember on Michael's side, they had about $2.3 billion in extra revenue. So that sort of nets out pretty close to our $2.2 billion. So that's sort of the main changes on the expense side for the current fiscal year. Just diving in a little bit on the asylum seeker, because this is sort of was the real big issue for the November plan outside of their PEG program. But the asylum seekers were really sort of the unforeseen costs that emerged over the summertime. And so there was a lot of media coverage when the November plan came out that the administration was putting up $1 billion in fiscal year 23 in federal funds to support all of their spending on the asylum seekers. And we've got a really great shop over here that has been working on homeless services for years now. And we sort of took a look at those numbers, and we put out our own report, which you can read on our website, and we'll distribute the link to. But we don't think that those costs are necessarily all going to hit in fiscal year 2023. And there's certain parts of that the administration was putting up that we didn't think were necessarily going to be hitting the city in the way that the administration was portraying it. And so here we've got the breakout of the administration's estimate of costs. That's $577 million for homeless services, 310 for health and hospitals, and about 100 million, a little over 100 million for the other agencies listed here. On our side, sorry about that. On our side, we don't really see the same level of hit going to homeless services. They already have some ceiling built in, or a little bit of extra ceiling room built into their budget for the current fiscal year, and we think that a lot of that's going to be absorbing this. So any costs you see here are what our projections are over the adopted budget, whereas the column to the left here is OMB's estimates of what's over the adopted budget. So we only think that there's about 261 million of extra costs in fiscal year 2023 for homeless services, and then we're taking the administration at their word for these other smaller agencies. We, however, did back out the increase in subsidy to H&H. And the reason being here is that H&H maintains its own budget. It is not a city agency, and everything that flows to H&H is part of the city's subsidy to that corporation. And so while there may be some increased costs, it's really unclear that all of that is going to accrue directly to H&H without being covered by Medicaid or other insurers. There's other programs that might be going on. And so while we might end up getting a bill for this, we really don't think that the order of magnitude is going to be 310 million. Remains to be seen. It could be 310 million, but we don't really think that that's going to be playing out the way that the administration has said. And additionally, we're assuming that all of this is going to be city funded at this point in time. When the November plan was released, the omnibus bill hadn't come out yet. And so this is something that we might change in the upcoming plans. But at that point in time, there was no federal monies that were clearly going to be available for the city to tap into. And so the administration sort of threw a little bit of a Hail Mary. And there is going to be 800 million that is available nationwide, not just for New York City, for those asylum seekers. But it really remains to be seen how much of that will be coming to New York City, and also if there are any strings attached to that, if it can only be spent on shelter costs, if it can only be spent on certain other things. So there's a little bit that we need to sort of get figured out there. And then we'll sort of see if that ends up covering just our 23 costs, or if it's going to be something that will cover what we think are going to be fiscal year 24 costs for homeless services of around 628 million. So that's sort of where we're at. But it is, you know, everyone is sort of tossing around a $1 billion number. That 1 billion, it really depends, you know, everything sort of is on a time scale with the budget. So it really remains to be seen what our total costs are going to be for that asylum seeker response. But then, you know, as Michael said, we don't have necessarily a rosy outlook here. There are significant pressure points that are on the horizon. As Michael said, you know, we're trying to nail the interest rate at the federal level. We might not get that soft landing, and so that's something that's out there. We don't think our current forecast is not showing a recession. We don't think that there's going to be a recession, but there's always that chance that that doesn't hit. And so, you know, right now we're predicting pretty anemic growth, pretty weak growth in our revenues over the plan window. And so, you know, if a recession does hit, you know, we're on a little bit of shaky ground there. So that's something to be on the lookout for. And then on the city spending side, we've got a lot of other issues that are coming up. We are essentially operating at this point in time without any collective bargaining contracts in place. Everything is expired. We're anticipating to go through a whole new round of collective bargaining. And right now, we don't know how much that's going to cost the city. The labor market is obviously very high. I don't know if anyone's looked for a job recently, but wages are going up, and or if you're trying to hire, it's often very difficult. If you're the city of New York, it's very difficult to hire. So that's been in the press a lot recently in terms of you know, just the overall labor market. And then for collective bargaining, right now the city only has about 1.25 percentage points baked into its labor reserves. And so what this means is that we've got a certain pot of money set aside for the increases stemming from collective bargaining agreements. Not arguments, although they often are. And so right now we've only got about a 1.25% increase budgeted. We don't think that that's going to be enough. We don't know exactly what that amount is going to be, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the unions are not going to settle for a 1.25 percentage increase. So that's something that we need to keep an eye on. And just for everyone's awareness, you know, when we start talking about percentage points on salary, the easiest sort of way to think about this is each percentage point is about $450 million in the first full year after that contract takes place. So, you know, if we're talking about a 3% raise, we're talking, a bit over 1.2 billion. And that's sort of the thing to keep in mind as you're just paying attention to these collective bargaining negotiations. The other part of staffing that has really become, a very hot topic in the media is the city's active headcount. The city has lost about 19,000 active positions since basically the start of the pandemic in January 2020. So that's a huge drop off, and it's really starting to impact service delivery. There have been media stories about a number of agencies that are really struggling to deliver services, as you heard from Councilmember Powers, HPD, HRA. So there's a lot of agencies that are really sort of struggling to hire and meet their needs. So that's a really big sort of question. There is, what's the new face of city government in the budget? And, are we able to expect, or should we be expecting lower levels of service at a higher cost? So that's something to be aware of. We also talked about the asylum seeker funds. Again, big thing here is how much of that's actually coming our way and what sort of conditions are attached to that funding. And then there's always, the perennial risks of what's going on with NYCHA, what's going on with MTA. Both of the two authorities have substantial operating gaps that are, propped up in at some points in time by subsidies from the city of New York. And so that's something that, we really have to be looking out for. Over at NYCHA, they've got a couple of things, the PACT program and the HPT, the Preservation Trust program. Those are both, trying to get NYCHA to a place of fiscal solvency that are really sort of untested right now, though. And so we're really sort of waiting to see what happens. We've had to put up more capital funding for PACT in recent years. And so that's something that we really have to keep an eye on. And then similarly, over at the MTA, they have holes in their budget that are still filled by unspecified state and federal funding. If that doesn't materialize, someone's going to be on the hook. And so we're really sort of interconnected with their fiscal health and our own economic fiscal health. They really do move the region. So it's one of these things that we have to keep an eye on. And then that's sort of the pressure points that are inclusive in the November plan. But then we really sort of have these questions that are coming up for the preliminary budget. Right now they're probably going to be releasing that within the next 2 weeks. So there's a lot of questions that are probably going to hopefully be answered by the preliminary budget. As Michael said, they haven't updated their revenue forecast yet. And so the big thing here is, what does that revenue forecast look like? Are they seeing, or are they going to reflect that strong growth, or at least in the early collections that we've seen on certain taxes for the current fiscal year? And what is that going to look like in the out years? It's going to be our first look at fiscal year 2027 from the forecast over on their side. So we sort of are looking to see, what does that far out year look like? How are they addressing those gaps? So that's really a big question. The next question is, how are they going to balance 2024? The preliminary budget is the first time that they have to balance the first out year. So next year, 2024, this could be our first sort of crack at seeing where they're going to be. Are they raising revenues? Are they lowering expenditures? We'll really want to be taking a look at that and sort of delving into that as they release their budget. They were going into this with their proposed gap of about 2.9 billion. We only thought that gap was about 2.4. So we'll sort of see what ends up happening there. The next thing is right after the release of the November plan, Mayor Adams announced another 50% vacancy reduction. So that's a reduction of further positions that have been left vacant for civilian positions, as well as anything that is not revenue generating. So the city has made a point to exempt anyone that's generating revenue for the city, and also the uniformed agencies. So that's something that we'll definitely want to take a look at, of who's actually achieving that, what are those impacts to services. And then the last item is whether or not the administration has made any progress in this round of collective bargaining. If they've come to a deal with DC 37, that's a really big bellwether. And so we'll want to be taking a look at that, seeing if they're moving anything into the labor reserve or moving anything out of the labor reserve. So that's one of the big things that we'll want to keep a look at or stay looking at during this next budget cycle. And so that is our presentation about our fiscal outlook. If you'd like to reach out to us, we've got our email addresses right here, and we'll be sending all of you this presentation. But yeah, we're ready if you guys have any questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I knew Joe would have his hand up before I even said that, but thank you. That was really fantastic. Joe.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Michael and Logan. On the projections, can you just comment on when you went out to 2026, what were on your assumptions? How are you factoring in population? I understand the highest tax earners, you don't know if they're leaving the city. What was the assumption though for total population or for our taxpayer base? As well as the tax rates. Are you making any assumptions about a change in tax rates? And
no, certainly.
I have a couple of questions, so if maybe
should we start with that one?
Yes.
Okay, certainly there's no tax rates changes that are projected in. We don't alter our forecast unless there's some tax change that's been enacted. So that, and there's population, we looked at the recent change in the tax filing population, which actually went up quite a bit in 2020. I don't think it's going to go up as much, but they have a very slow growth in population.
Okay.
And I think the more important question is, where is it growing and what income, for at least in terms of tax revenue,
right.
Which income groups are growing and which aren't.
Are you guys familiar with, I am not, I just know that it was recently passed, the Financial Data Transparency Act, and I'm hearing it's going to affect reporting by state and local governments. Can you comment on that, or?
I don't know enough about it to really comment.
Okay.
I know of it, but we in general are for more transparency.
Okay. Do any of the budget numbers or your forecasts, your projections, does any of it factor in other post-employment benefits?
Yeah, we do take a look at OPEB, and that's something that we're basically at this point in time in lockstep with OMB on that front. There are substantial increases, and that's actually, pension and other post-employment benefits are really sort of drivers of costs in the out years, particularly in 2025 and 2026. There are substantial increases there. And that's something that we do agree with OMB on currently, and so that's something that we do think is going to be an issue going forward. I think there's a lot going on with that right now, obviously, on a local level, and so that's something that is there's, I believe, legislation pending over at City Council to make changes to the laws allowing for like Medicare Advantage and switching folks to that. So that is definitely something that's in the mix.
Is any of the unfunded OPEB or pension included in the budget surplus or the gaps?
Not in this particular one. We do believe that there's going to be enough for a prepayment of costs this year. Obviously, with 2.2 billion. The sort of assumption that we make with our with our surpluses is that that's something that goes almost either, it'll either go to the rainy day fund or it'll go to a prepayment of next year's liabilities. So that's something that is likely going to be happening, but we'll sort of see how that goes.
Okay. What I'm referring to though is the unfunded amounts.
The unfunded portion.
Yes.
We'll have to let me go ahead and take a look at that. I'll talk to our analysts about that, and we can definitely provide you an answer on that front.
Okay. And then the last question is in your estimates and projections, were any the collective bargaining? What was your assumptions there?
Our assumptions right now for collective bargaining, we haven't really touched anything. We don't want to make an assumption that there's going to be a certain level of increase without sort of knowing that that's in the works. Again, sort of as Michael was saying about tax rates, I don't think that we want to go and make the assumption that they're going to be asking for certain amounts. I wouldn't be surprised if it's much higher than what's currently included in the labor reserve. So I think that that's something where those out year gaps that we are predicting definitely have an opportunity to grow, but it sort of remains to be seen, and we haven't really attached a number to a lot of that. So
okay, I appreciate it. Thank you both.
Thank you. Mary, you had your hand up. I don't mean to call on you, but I say, do you still?
Yeah, I think they already covered it. I just was struck with, and maybe I misread this, that you're predicting lower fringe and debt service. Is that because of the reduced headcount right now? Or I think that's the first time I've seen a presentation by you guys that included lower fringe and debt service.
Yeah, no, right now there are obviously lower headcount is definitely driving lower PS or personnel service costs across the board, and that's inclusive of fringe. On the debt service side, that's actually it's not too uncommon that we've got a difference from OMB on debt service. They have always included essentially where we differ from them is on their variable rate debt. They make an assumption that's pretty conservative, so they tend to build in some surplus. That's obviously, as interest rates rise, that's changing a little bit. And the gap between our forecast and their forecast on debt service costs is really shrinking. And so that's something that they make an assumption of a 4% rate. Ours is starting to climb towards that because of rising interest rates.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
I just had a question. You mentioned that you're not making an assumption about the high earners are moving out of New York or who is actually staying or moving, but you said that you're going to get different figures in late spring or summer. Where does that data come from?
We get each year a total population file of New York State tax returns, of course, with names, social security numbers, addresses blanked out, but we can isolate the New York City residents and look at not only what their income is and what their tax liability is, but also the forms of income. So we were able to see in 2020 a dramatic increase in capital gains realizations. We could tell, that wages declined by a certain amount and transfer payments went up. So particularly unemployment insurance compensation.
I see. Other questions from the committee? This has been so comprehensive and very useful, and something that we will pore over once we receive your report. Thank you so very much, Michael and Logan. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to turn to, if I may, to our attendees. I see I have a hand, if I may, for another question, if that's okay with the two of you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Mr. Pompey, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question? Hello, Mr. Pompey?
Yeah, I had to unmute, I'm sorry. Hi, Logan. When you do the projection, do you put any study on efficiency and accountability? Because as a user of agencies, I often find the efficiency could be higher, but I don't know enough. But for sure, there is no accountability. Sometimes you call, you get very different answers. You ask to send something in writing, nobody wants to put anything in writing. You ask names, they tell you the first name, they refuse to give you their family name. You ask if you can tape record a registration, and they hang up. So that reads no accountability for many agencies. Hey, I'm a real estate broker, so I have to deal with agencies, especially in terms of dealing with vouchers. It's a very complicated system, could be simplified. I think they are underfunded, but if they were more efficient and more accountable, the money would make, probably would double the level of service they can give. And I wonder if there's anything that is being done in this sense.
So we definitely include a whole variety of budget options that are available for the public's viewing on our website that include a whole number of things related to both building inspections, HPD procedures. A lot of what we're looking at is trying to deliver, either savings through efficiencies or even just a higher value of government service. So that's something that we do look at. I'll go ahead and I'll drop that in the chat for everyone if people are interested in looking at that. But we've got a file of that. As a nonpartisan agency, we don't make a recommendation that those things actually take place. We do just look at what the pros and cons of those approaches are and who may be hurt by those and then who might be benefited by those. So we don't take a position on enacting any of them, but we do put those out there for study and as an option for other folks.
Thank you. Any final questions from the committee? Okay, I have one final question. It's not really a question. I don't think it's a budget question. At what stage does an agency get beyond, I guess it's not a budget question, personnel where it becomes, danger Will Robinson?
I think it probably depends on who you're asking. And so, there's going to be a difference between, your rank and file members of the agency and the administration on what constitutes a real inability to complete their core mission. So I think it probably depends, and it's going to differ from agency to agency, really. There are certain agencies where I used to oversee the budgets of a bunch of really small agencies, and you lose one person, and that's huge, and not being able to replace that person could really put a real damper on a lot of the smaller agencies. And then in other agencies, you lose a person a day, and so it really depends on the agency, the size of the agency, and their organization.
I think it also depends on the jobs that they do. One of the disturbing things that I've heard, and I mean to bug Logan and his assistant to look into this further, but we've heard that Department of Finance is losing a lot of its audit staff, and the audit staff brings in a lot of revenue. They're about close to $1 billion a year in revenue in audits of business tax collections and corporations. And that's an area that the department has put a lot of resources in, computer programs to identify those businesses that are likely to generate revenue if you do in fact audit them. And if they're not able to retain auditors, that's going to really cut into revenue. So I don't know if collecting taxes is considered essential enough for a lot of people, but certainly from a budget point of view, it's a very big cause for concern.
It's and we're looking actually at a whole host of titles, but a lot of this is sort of the when we start talking about vacancy reductions, a lot of that, the vacancy reductions are sort of a acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth, which is that the city's having a real tough time retaining staff in a really tight labor market. And so, when we've lost 19,000 workers since 2020, and that's net. So, we've lost a lot more. We've got, there have been folks that have been brought in to replace some of them, but clearly, when you're down 19,000, that's a lot of folks. So we're really seeing, as I was saying earlier, a sort of changing face of city government, both on, whose butt's in that chair, and then also, the level of people and level of service that we're able to expect here.
And also where that chair is. One I've been trying to hire for about 2 years, and actually I had my first success, but one of the first things people ask is, do you allow hybrid schedules? So that's very important for a lot of people. And I'm not saying that that's the sole cause of people leaving city government, but it certainly isn't helping. The mandated 5 days a week in the office.
Sure.
There were hiring woes before then, but yeah, as Michael said, it's not necessarily the perk that everybody's looking for. It's 5 days in the office.
Sure, understood. Any final questions? Gentlemen, thank you so much. We are so deeply appreciative. Thank you. We look forward to disseminating your report. Any last comments for us, or?
Just, I'm sorry, just we'll be issuing another report after the preliminary budget comes out. And I think we're gonna talk about whether we can move very quickly and if not issue a full report, at least issue the important tables and graphs that illustrate how our forecast has changed. So I'm hoping that will be available, not within a month, but soon after, I would hope.
If you are free and would welcome, if you'd like to spend an evening with us again after that preliminary report, we would love to have you. I saw Logan's head go like Logan will be
no.
But if you are free and would like to share your views with us after the preliminary report, we would always welcome having you.
Okay, thank you.
We can talk after that. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Very appreciate.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay, last but not least, we have now, I hope I do not, Victor, am I saying it correctly?
Yeah, it's Victoire.
Victoire, hi, how are you? Scherer, is that correct? Victoire Scherer?
Yeah.
From the New York Civil Liberties Union, is that correct? She's here and she is going to provide the committee with some Know Your Rights material, and also she's going to talk to us about the New York New York Police Department Strategic Response Unit, Response Group. So Victoire, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I'm a volunteer with the New York Civil Liberties Union, also known as NYCLU, which is what I'll be referring to it as because that's a long name. I actually work in CB5, and I'm here today because we have a campaign to disband a specific unit of the NYPD called the Strategic Response Group, also sometimes known as the Hats and Bats or the Riot Cop Unit. And there's been a slightly new development in the unit that will impact CB5 constituents even more than they were before. So just for background, the NYCLU has a protest monitoring program that's been in place since June 2020. It involves volunteers who go to protests and document and observe police brutality and police behavior. And through that program, the NYPD's Strategic Response Group, or SRG, was identified as the main catalyst for violence and bias in protest spaces. So why this matters for Community Board 5, in addition to any protests that may happen in the area. So recently, I think it was about 2 months ago, the NYPD announced that the SRG would be deployed to 20 additional precincts across New York City, predominantly in Black and brown neighborhoods that they consider to be quote unquote high crime areas. CB5 happens to have one or more precincts within it, where the SRG will newly be deployed on a more like permanent basis. Just for more background, the SRG is not tied to a specific precinct. They're a tactical rapid response unit, so they kind of go wherever they're needed, but this changes things because it means they'll be deployed more in certain areas of the city, including yours. So just a really brief history of the SRG. It was formed in 2015, so it's a pretty recent unit of the NYPD. It was formed to address counterterrorism, but their actual counterterrorism work is unclear and unseen, and there's no transparency as to when they are deployed for that purpose. And after early pushback from advocates, the NYPD retracted their plans to include protest in the SRG scope, but then they went back on that, and the protest action is their main area of activity now. So for instance, in April 2015, they were deployed to a protest for Freddie Gray, where they brutalized protesters. And then in 2016, their bike squad was created, which had an estimate of 275 officers at the time. So this unit is known as the most violent unit of the NYPD. It is a voluntary unit, which means that officers opt in to being in this unit. It attracts the most aggressive, predominantly male and white officers who are trained in tactics like mass arrests, kettling, which is encirclement and trapping of protesters so that they cannot get out, and using military weapons like the long-range acoustic device, LRAD, which has a sound cannon function that is actually now illegal to use in New York. And many of these officers have long misconduct records. So regarding these misconduct records, officers who are in the specific unit have a disproportionately high rate of misconduct compared to those in the general NYPD population. We have a lot of stats on this. I won't go through all of them, but the most telling one for me is that SRG officers on average have twice the amount of non-NYPD and non-SRG NYPD officers. So an officer who is in that unit in like very gross terms is just twice as more likely to cause violence as an NYPD officer not in that unit. And these officers have many, many complaints with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So the SRG is also known as an escalatory force, notably because of the types of gear that it has and the weapons that it uses. So on the right, you can see an image of the types of tactical gear that the NYPD has. The SRG bike cops, their uniform costs over $2,000 per officer. And they have body armor, riot helmets, shields. They employ the LRAD, which I mentioned is a military grade weapon, tasers. They also have batons, which is why they're called hats and bats. And they have, as other officers do, their NYPD issued gun. Their last known budget, which is from 2016, was $90 million. And the estimated size, again from 2016, was 800 officers. This is the latest number that we have because there is so little transparency, and in the city budget, their budget is not broken out separately as a unit. It's under the counterterrorism unit. Sorry, not counterterrorism. I believe it's special forces. The NYPD's protest monitoring team has compiled footage from over 70 protests from May 2020 to January 2021. Obviously, that was a while ago, so there have been many more since. And it documented 40 instances of arrests of nonviolent protesters. So that's not the total number of arrests, that's the number of protests where there was at least one arrest. So there were many more than 40 arrests of individuals. 24 instances of kettling, which is again trapping protesters to make mass arrests. 39 instances of use of force, which can include things like tasing, hitting with a baton, shoving, things like that. And the strategic response group was present and participating at all but one of these incidents. So essentially, when they show up, you know there's going to be brutality or arrests of some kind. But they're not only violent at protests and toward protesters, they're also violent towards everyday citizens, and also press and bystanders. So there are countless examples that we can use, but one of them is on June 5th, 2021, the SRG cleared Washington Square Park at 10 p.m. For an illegitimate curfew that they imposed, and there they tased, beat, and kettled park goers, including a couple who was on a date, a houseless person who was in the park, and at least one photographer. In the summer of 2022, the unit was central to sweeping homeless encampments, which they did so very violently. This was primarily in Lower Manhattan, but it has also been seen other parts of Manhattan as well. And the SRG, which is supposed to be a counterterrorism unit, was nowhere to be seen during the subway shooting in Sunset Park. And they were actually clearing out a homeless encampment a couple blocks from where the subway shooter was arrested a couple of days later. When the SRG does actually respond to crime versus protesters or people who are just everyday citizens, it leads to tragedy. In 2018, they murdered Zahid Vassell in Crown Heights because they were deployed to a neighborhood that they were not familiar with, and they showed up without proper intel, and this young man was shot and killed. So why this matters? Over the last 3 years, NYCLU has worked with community members to collect documentation and firsthand accounts about the SRG's violence in and out of protests. With little transparency about the size, scope, and funding of the SRG, this unit functions as a rogue entity. And the NYCLU believes the unit has no place in protests or in communities. So constituents need to know that this unit is now being deployed more into their communities versus primarily at protests. So now I'll go into a little bit of detail about the campaign that NYCLU launched. The campaign officially launched in January of 2022, so about a year ago, with over 50 community organizations, including some that I'm part of. The demands are for the SRG to be disbanded completely as a unit, which basically means to have it wiped completely from the NYPD budget. That's how it would be disbanded, not through bills. And for the millions of funds, we estimate 90 million, it could be more, it could be less. Again, that's the 2016 number. So for those millions of funds to be reinvested into communities and programs that actually keep New Yorkers safe. So City Council has finally, after a year of campaigning, scheduled an oversight hearing on the SRG unit for January 23rd, 2023, which is coming up soon. A lot of community members and groups will be speaking at that hearing, and they will be testifying to their personal experiences with the unit. So if you'd like to get involved in the campaign or submit testimony about this unit's deployment into communities, I'll post some links in the chat for you to get involved. And if you have any questions, I can help answer those. And if I can't, I can point you to the campaign lead at NYCLU. So that's it.
Great, thank you. Let's take some questions from the committee. Mary.
Yeah, you mentioned that this was going to be expanded into 2 precincts in CB5. Which ones are you referring to?
Yeah, that would be a good question for NYCLU. I know it's at least 1. That's why we're here in this meeting. But I will see if they can check and see how many it is. It's probably 1 or 2. I would say probably 2 at most, but I'm not sure which ones.
Probably the
I wanna
Midtown
say Times
South
Square,
and
but don't
Midtown North precincts, because they lead the district in crime.
Well, you said you know of 1. Can you tell us which one you know of?
Oh, sorry. I meant that I know that there is at least 1. I'm not sure which one it is, but it should be the ones that are the highest in crime. So Joe may be correct for those 2.
Other questions from the committee? I have a question. You said there's an estimated 800 officers in the unit. So is it your sense that people are pulled from various other assignments and they're trained and put into this unit? It's not a permanent unit?
No, so it is a permanent unit. So if an officer is part of the strategic response group, they are full-time part of the strategic response group. So they will always have that uniform that denotes that. So when they're not being deployed to protests, which is, 99% of what they do, I honestly cannot tell you where they are or what they're doing.
You made a comment that it attracts the most aggressive officers. I'm wondering how you know that, if in fact they also do other things. Like I wonder how you have that data.
Yeah, so let me pull up the slideshow again. So that is both from the observations compiled by the New York Civil Liberties Union, from their practical observations on the field, as well as using data from Civilian Complaint Review Board complaints and comparing the complaints of strategic response group officers to the complaints of the entire NYPD population, and trying to see if there are discrepancies between the averages of the complaints, if that makes sense.
You'd need to have the names of the 800 people of the strategic response group in order to compare, right? If you're doing one against the other.
Yeah, that would be ideal, but we're comparing, because not every officer has a complaint. So we're comparing between officers who have complaints. We're comparing between officers who have complaints, SRG and non-SRG NYPD officers. So those who are already violent are even more violent in the strategic response group, if that makes sense.
Kind of doesn't to me. I don't understand that. Mark.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. I saw an article online in the Amsterdam News that in response to a report, I think the same report that you referenced, the New York Police Department said that they reviewed and implemented suggestions to their policies from organizations like the NYCLU. So I'm curious whether or not that's true and whether or not there's been any changes since the initial data was collected.
Yeah, I have not noticed any changes, and I think the NYCLU could say the same. I know there was a push I think it was a year, maybe a year and a half ago, where I believe it was Mayor de Blasio who said that the strategic response group would no longer be deployed to protest unless necessary, but that has nothing's changed. That's absolutely not been the case. I specifically organized with a pro-abortion group that defends abortion clinics. And we have had the strategic response group come and arrest our clinic defenders, at least 3 or 4 instances, over a dozen arrests the past 6 months.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to be rude when I was just.
No,
I was just trying to understand. If I'm just trying to understand, so if you have 800 people in this unit and you're trying to compare their backgrounds against the general background of police officers, I'm just trying to understand how you make the claim that they're the most aggressive officers are in one unit versus the population as a whole, if you're not comparing everyone's records. I just don't understand how you get there. I'm not trying to be rude about it. I just
no. I also didn't. Yeah, no, I totally understand. Yeah.
That data.
I would reach out to
data to get there.
Sorry.
Have you used any other data to get to that statement? Is just.
Yeah. So the rest of that data is all, tangible observational data from people, protest monitors on the ground who have been observing and comparing regular officers versus strategic response group officers. I don't most of the protest arrests that happen are done by strategic response group officers. It's very unlikely a precinct officer would arrest anyone at a protest.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So it is a lot of, it's a lot of tangible, and they have been to over, I think the monitors have been to over 100 protests now. So they keep track of how many arrests are at each one, whether the SRG was present, any behaviors that the SRG displayed. So they can definitely share that with you if needed.
Understood. Other questions from the committee? Okay, I'm going to go to the attendees. Questions from the attendees. Barbara. Barbara, you're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have a mousy mouse. This was a very, very disturbing report, certainly, and I think that nobody condones brutality under any circumstances. But it sounds, I run a community organization. It's a business improvement district. I represent all the business tenants in the neighborhood, some residents, not as many residents, and property owners in the neighborhood. And we did back in several years ago with the Black Lives Matter, had the protesters going through the neighborhood. It's the Garment District in Midtown West. And we had 30 storefronts that were smashed and looted and that kind of thing. And I think it was a strategic response team that was there. We also, as some of the committee members here have suggested, have some of the highest crime rates in the city of New York, in fact, because of the drug problems that we have in the neighborhood. So one of the things that my question to you and what I'm really wondering is, it sounds to me like this group, the SRG, is a self-selecting group. And if it's a self-selecting group, you have people that are going to opt to go into it who want to, pardon my expression, kick some ass. And, I'm rude. And they have misconduct records. And what I'm wondering is, I do think that it's important to have a unit, not necessarily a military unit that's armed as if they're going to Ukraine, but a unit for these huge crowds. I mean, if you think about Times Square just this past last weekend, where the guy with the machete wounded 3 NYPD officers. I mean, if that guy had just been able to go into the crowd of civilians, we can't imagine. So this is my question to you. What I heard was sort of horrifying, but it is also a little bit frightening to me to think that we don't have a very strong and robust police presence when you have huge crowds of agitated people. And somebody, I think you had mentioned there's an oversight hearing on January 23rd. I'm wondering if the city councilor, who maybe Marissa or Renee, you know, but who can exert oversight where you don't allow a unit to be self-selecting, and where if you have rogue officers or aggressive officers, that they're fired. I mean, Pat Lynch will defend anybody as long as they're wearing a uniform. And I think I'm wondering if there aren't things that we can't be saying to our elected officials that gets rid of the rotten apples. Because at least in my experience working with Midtown South, and it's not with the SRG unit per se, but we've just had such incredible positive outcomes. So I guess my question is, how do you get rid of the rot? How do you fire them? But ensure that when you have these large groups of people that are really excited, there's protection.
I don't know if that question was directed at me. It's a very broad, giant loaded topic that I probably shouldn't get into, especially with my views as an individual, because I might get in trouble on this call. But I think you're opening up a discussion that is worth having with your community, with your electeds. And I definitely encourage you to, if you can't show up on January 23rd, I believe it's being live streamed, so you can listen in and potentially even voice, your concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely, on behalf of the community that I represent, which is the same community that CB5 represents. It's a much smaller piece of it, of course. So I will go to that hearing, but it's discouraging to me that when you have rogue actors that are aggressive and inappropriate, that we can't, as a city, weed them out so that your force stands for excellence. And I guess my question is, what's the mechanism for doing that?
Thank you, Barbara. I think it's a very good point. Other questions? Charles.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering, just quick few things. I was wondering if you have any data on how often these officers in this unit actually deploy their body cameras, and if they are in fact wearing any. And I was just thinking, maybe it'd be better if protesters worked with the police and maybe came up with a strategy of, like a plan of, hey, we want to protest about something, and then they could work with the police about what areas maybe they could go and protest in, and maybe have separate routes or something like they do with the parades, where it's more organized if possible. And yeah, I was just really wondering if there's any other data on what sparks the officers to get aggressive. Is it maybe a threat that they're encountering, or are they just randomly getting aggressive? So I'm just wondering what's happening there. Thank you.
Yeah, so for the body cam, I don't believe there's data, but from personal observation, NYPD officers are actually very, very good at turning on their body cams. They're very good at doing it like before anything happens. Sometimes they'll drop them. I've seen that happen, but predominantly, I I've seen officers using their body cams. Whether they'll release the footage after is an entirely different question, or what they will do with it as well. In terms of protesters working with the police, there are certain protests that do that. Most protests do not, because inherently a protest, the whole point is to disrupt the peace. So working with the authorities and getting a permit is not something that protesters would do. It's also a big hassle, and many people don't feel safe working with the police, especially considering units like the Strategic Response Group that will beat and arrest protesters. So there are a bunch of reasons why people wouldn't work with the police at a protest. And then I'm sorry, I can't remember your last point or question.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering about what sparks them to be aggressive in the first place. Is it just randomly, or do they feel somehow at threat or something like that?
Yeah, if they do feel a threat, there usually is not a threat. It is a self-created threat. Police are created to see everybody as a potential criminal, so that's one part of it. And then also the instances in the presentation I shared of arrests were all noted as nonviolent arrests. Arrest of nonviolent protesters. So in those documented instances, there was no apparent reason for the arrests and brutality to happen.
Yes. By the way, I don't have access to the chat, unfortunately, so maybe the board could email me the links. And just one last thing, I was just wondering, does this infringe on people's right to assembly? Isn't that one of the rights in the Bill of Rights or something?
Yes, it does. And that's why the NYCLU is, having this entire campaign. One of its main purposes is to make sure that individuals' civil rights are protected. And they believe that this unit, the Strategic Response Group, infringes upon those rights time and time again.
And has there been any cases of police filming or profiling protesters, maybe like that sort of thing?
I know that there have been instances of officers that had lists with photos of protesters inside a precinct. I don't really know, I know anecdotal incidents of officers filming protesters with their personal devices, but nothing documented by the NYCLU.
Thank you.
Mary, did I see your hand for one last?
Sorry, very quickly, Victoria, I think it might be helpful for you just very briefly to touch on what you've seen. I'm assuming you're referring to the old St. Patrick standoff that goes on, where fringe people who have been disavowed by the Catholic Church routinely try to stop women from accessing legal abortion. I don't think that any of those religious protesters have been violently arrested. Am I right? It's usually the people trying to protect the women's access to abortion, and also that this is not a large group. These aren't thousands of people. This is a small thing that goes on once or twice a month, right? Just so people get the context of how these people are deployed.
Yeah, so just stepping out of my NYCLU volunteer role for a second, because this is just something I do with NYC for Abortion Rights. Essentially, on the first Saturday of every month, there is a group called Witness for Life that is based out of Old St. Patrick's Cathedral in Soho. And this group, which usually has between 50 and 150 people, march from the church to the Planned Parenthood clinic, which is 2 blocks away. And there they harass patients who are going in, not just for abortions, just for, anyone who's going in that Saturday morning is going to face harassment. I think that may be CB1 or CB2, I'm not sure. But the NYPD is present. Sorry, let me back up. So the group that I'm with, NYC for Abortion Rights, we have clinic defenses once a month, where we essentially try to delay the arrival of the anti-abortion people so much that they basically miss all the appointments and they can't harass anybody. And the NYPD has persistently escorted, defended the anti-abortion folks and violently arrested clinic defenders. Last month, there were 7 arrests, including one that was extremely violent. Someone was put in a chokehold. And it's just very unfortunate that, there's a clear bias demonstrated on the part of the NYPD and specifically the SRG, which is the unit making arrests at those actions. One of the anti-abortion people, one of their leaders, was accidentally knocked over by an SRG officer. And another officer yelled, "No, not her," because they were about to arrest her. And then they helped her up and apologized and arrested us instead. So there is like clear documented bias towards a specific group. And yeah, I can help answer questions about that. I know it's not part of this district, but that's just the latest instance of SRG brutality. The summer, it was, the focus was a lot on the homeless encampments that they were violently destroying, but recently it's been a lot of brutalizing abortion clinic defenders.
And isn't this, so who is giving these orders? Isn't that the issue ultimately?
So
who is the commander of this unit?
So that's something that I'm not totally sure about, because usually there is an assigned commander on the scene, which in these protests the past couple of months has been Elias Nikas. I believe he's the Manhattan, he got promoted recently. I can't remember his new title, but he's like one of the NYPD Manhattan heads. However, I have heard an officer at a protest, the community affairs officer who was in charge of the protest, saying once it's in the SRG, once the SRG takes over, it's out of our hands. So it appears that the SRG has its own, basically can do whatever they want. So whoever their commanding officer is on the scene gets to decide what they want to do, even if there's a higher ranking non-SRG officer there.
And so where does the SRG fall in terms of who is their commanding, what unit is that?
They're officially under, I believe it's called Special Forces Unit or Special something unit. There are a couple other units besides the SRG under that fall under that category. Hold on, I may be able to find it really quickly. Oh, Special Operations Bureau. That's the higher group that they're part of in the NYPD.
So, and then is this what you are going to bring, this bias? Is this part of what you're going to bring to the hearing?
Yeah, exactly. Demonstrating bias, demonstrating brutality, and then, it'll be a lot of community members just testifying on their own experiences, and also groups talking about their local neighborhood experiences with the strategic response group.
Great. Any other questions from the committee? Any questions from any attendees? Okay, seeing none, Victoria, if you want to provide any information, we can send it to the committee. I believe you included a fact sheet And we can send it out to the committee for anybody who wants to have it. Thank you so much for coming and sharing all the information with us. We really, really appreciate it. And I think that is it, unless you would like to add any further information.
No, yeah, the fact sheet that I posted in the chat is basically a 2-pager of everything I went over. The protest timeline doesn't have the most recent protests in it, and definitely watch it at your own discretion. And then the sign up link is on there as well to testify at the hearing.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. It was a long one tonight. I appreciate everybody hanging in. Thank you very much. And Happy New Year. Good
Thanks.
night, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.